When security architecture is done well, it feels less like guessing and more like making disciplined choices that you can explain to someone who was not in the room when you made them. That discipline usually comes from risk assessment artifacts, which are the documents and records created during risk work that capture what could go wrong, how bad it would be, and what the organization is willing to do about it. Beginners often picture risk assessment as a separate activity that happens in spreadsheets and meetings, far away from design decisions. But in real architecture, those artifacts are supposed to become inputs to design. If you ignore them, you may build controls that are impressive but misaligned, or you may miss the few risks that truly matter. If you use them correctly, they help you prioritize, justify trade-offs, and communicate decisions in a way that holds up during review. The goal here is to learn how to take those risk artifacts and turn them into practical architectural choices without drowning in paperwork or freezing delivery. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Risk assessment artifacts can sound like a fancy phrase, so it helps to name what they are in plain language and why they exist. An artifact is any record that captures the results of risk thinking, such as an asset inventory, a data flow diagram, a threat list, a vulnerability summary, a likelihood and impact rating, or a set of recommended treatments. Some artifacts are formal, like a risk register entry with an owner and a status, and some are informal, like a documented assumption about what a system will be exposed to. These artifacts matter because they preserve context, and context is what prevents the same argument from restarting every time a system changes. They also help new people understand why decisions were made, which is critical in long-lived systems where teams rotate. In exams and in real life, the architect is expected to use risk information to make choices that are defensible, not simply choose controls because they are popular. When you learn to treat artifacts as decision inputs, architecture becomes more coherent and less personal. A risk assessment is not a single number, and it is not just a feeling that something is dangerous, because it is a structured attempt to understand uncertainty and potential harm. The simplest way to think about it is that risk combines how likely a bad event is and how damaging it would be if it happened. But even that simple idea depends on assumptions. Likelihood depends on exposure, attacker interest, and how easily a weakness could be exploited, while impact depends on what assets are affected and what consequences follow. Risk artifacts capture these assumptions so the organization can discuss them openly instead of hiding them inside someone's intuition. Beginners sometimes assume that risk assessment is only about threats, but it also includes operational failures, human mistakes, and business changes that can create security gaps. In architecture, this matters because many attacks are actually failures that look like attacks, and a resilient design must handle both. When you incorporate risk artifacts, you are using a broader view of what can go wrong to shape your design. One of the most useful artifacts is the identification of assets and their importance, because architecture choices must protect what matters most, not what is easiest to secure. An asset can be data, a system, a service, an identity store, a key repository, or even the ability to deploy safely, and risk artifacts often highlight which assets are critical to the mission. If the artifact says that a certain dataset drives revenue or contains sensitive personal information, that immediately affects decisions about access control, segmentation, monitoring, and retention. If the artifact shows that a service is mission-critical, that affects resilience decisions, such as redundancy and safe failure behavior. This is where the classic security qualities of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, become practical because different assets emphasize different qualities. A beginner might protect everything equally, but the artifacts help you focus effort where the impact is highest. When architecture priorities follow asset criticality, the design becomes more cost-effective and easier to justify. Another powerful artifact is the system's data flow understanding, because risk is often created not by a single component, but by movement across boundaries. Data flow artifacts show where information enters, where it is processed, where it is stored, and where it leaves, including third-party connections and administrative access paths. These flows reveal trust boundaries, which are the places where assumptions change and where controls must be strongest. If a risk artifact highlights that sensitive data crosses from a controlled environment into a partner environment, that shapes decisions about minimization, encryption, monitoring, and contract-based controls. If the flow shows that administrative access crosses from an internal network into a production environment, that shapes decisions about privileged access and auditability. Beginners sometimes focus only on the main application and forget the surrounding systems like logging, backups, and analytics, but data flow artifacts expose those hidden paths. When you incorporate these flows into design reviews, you catch problems early, like unnecessary sharing or unclear ownership. Risk becomes easier to manage when the architecture matches the real movement of data. Threat modeling outputs are another category of artifact, and they help you think about how harm could occur in a way that guides control selection. A threat model is essentially a structured story about who might attack, what they might try, and where the system is vulnerable due to design. The important point is that a threat model is not a prediction of one specific attack. It is a way to explore plausible paths so you can reduce exposure and limit blast radius. If a threat model highlights credential theft as a likely path, that supports stronger authentication, better session controls, and tighter privileged access. If it highlights misuse of an integration interface, that supports tighter interface contracts and better monitoring of data transfer. Beginners sometimes misread threat models as a list of scary possibilities and feel overwhelmed, but the goal is prioritization, not fear. When you use the model as an input, you can explain why certain controls are prioritized and why others are deferred. In exams, this looks like choosing the answer that addresses the most plausible attack paths given the scenario's constraints. Vulnerability assessment artifacts also feed architecture choices, but they must be interpreted carefully because raw vulnerability lists do not automatically map to design decisions. A vulnerability list might show missing patches, weak configurations, or exposed services, but architecture is about reducing risk systematically, not playing whack-a-mole. When vulnerability artifacts show recurring categories of issues, that often signals an architectural weakness, such as inconsistent identity enforcement, poor segmentation, or fragile change control. Architects use those signals to propose patterns and standards that prevent the same weaknesses from reappearing, rather than relying only on repeated remediation. Vulnerability artifacts also help you decide where compensating controls are needed, such as additional monitoring around a legacy system that cannot be patched quickly. Beginners often assume that patching is the only answer, but sometimes architecture must reduce exposure by isolating a vulnerable component or limiting its privileges until remediation is possible. When you incorporate vulnerability artifacts into design, you turn today's findings into tomorrow's stronger baseline. That is one of the clearest ways risk work becomes architecture work. Now we come to the heart of the title, which is trade-offs, because many architecture decisions are not about choosing a perfect option, but about choosing the best option under constraints. Risk artifacts help here because they provide a shared reference for what is at stake and what assumptions are driving the decision. If one option improves confidentiality but reduces availability, risk artifacts help you judge whether that availability reduction threatens a mission objective or is acceptable. If one option improves monitoring and auditability but increases operational complexity, the artifacts help you decide whether the added complexity introduces new risk that cancels out the benefit. Trade-offs also include cost, time, user experience, and maintainability, and risk artifacts help you avoid pretending those factors do not matter. Beginners often feel uncomfortable admitting trade-offs, as if security must always demand the strongest control, but architecture is about balancing security outcomes with real-world delivery. The exam often tests this by offering answers that are very secure but unrealistic, and the best answer is the one that manages the most important risks while respecting constraints. To make trade-offs defensible, you need to connect each architectural choice back to the specific risk statements in the artifacts, rather than arguing from general principles alone. A risk statement usually includes a condition, a consequence, and a sense of likelihood, and it often names the asset at risk. When you link a control decision to that statement, you can explain not only what you chose, but why you chose it and what risk it reduces. This is also where prioritization becomes visible, because some risks will be accepted temporarily or treated later, and that choice must be explicit. If a design decision cannot be tied to a risk or requirement, it may still be useful, but it is harder to justify when challenged. Conversely, if a major risk has no architectural response, that gap should be obvious and uncomfortable, which is a good thing because it forces attention. Beginners sometimes think risk artifacts are just documentation, but their real value is enabling traceability from risk to design. When traceability exists, reviews become calmer and decisions become easier to defend. Risk acceptance and risk treatment decisions are also artifacts, and they often shape architecture more than learners expect. When an organization accepts risk, it is not saying the risk is not real. It is saying that given constraints, the organization will live with it, at least for now, and that decision should have an owner and a rationale. Architects must design in a way that respects accepted risk without ignoring it, which often means adding monitoring, containment, or contingency plans so the risk does not silently expand. When a risk is treated, the treatment type matters, such as whether you mitigate through controls, transfer through contracts, avoid by changing the design, or accept with documented rationale. These treatment decisions affect the architecture's shape because they influence where controls are placed and how strong they must be. Beginners sometimes assume that the safest move is always to mitigate, but mitigation can introduce complexity and cost that creates new operational risk. A mature architect uses the treatment artifacts to select controls that fit the organization's chosen strategy and to document what remains. It is also important to recognize that risk artifacts are snapshots in time, and architecture must account for change, because systems evolve and so does risk. A design choice that was reasonable under one threat environment or business context may become less reasonable later, and risk artifacts help you notice when assumptions have changed. For example, if the system becomes internet-facing when it previously was internal, likelihood changes dramatically, and the architecture may need stronger boundary controls and monitoring. If the data stored becomes more sensitive, impact changes, and the architecture may need stronger access control and evidence retention. Good architecture builds in review points so that changes trigger a revisit of key artifacts, not a full restart of the project. Beginners sometimes fear that this creates endless paperwork, but the goal is targeted revisiting of the assumptions that matter most. When risk artifacts are living inputs, the architecture stays aligned with reality instead of drifting into outdated decisions. This is also how you avoid surprises during audits, because you can show that risk thinking kept pace with system change. Incorporating risk artifacts also means handling uncertainty honestly, because many risk ratings are not precise and different stakeholders may disagree. Architecture cannot wait for perfect certainty, so it uses artifacts to make uncertainty explicit and then chooses designs that are robust to that uncertainty. If likelihood is unclear but impact is high, you may choose layered defenses that reduce blast radius without overcommitting to a single expensive control. If impact is moderate but likelihood is high due to frequent exposure, you may choose simpler controls that can be applied consistently and quickly. A common beginner mistake is to treat risk scores as absolute truth and then argue about the number instead of the decision, but mature teams treat the score as a signal that guides discussion. The architect's job is to turn imperfect inputs into clear decisions with traceable rationale. When you can explain your assumptions and how they influence the design, reviewers are more likely to trust the outcome even if they might rate the risks slightly differently. That trust is a practical outcome of good risk integration. Another important connection is between risk artifacts and control baselines, because baselines translate risk understanding into repeatable expectations that teams can follow without reinventing decisions. If risk artifacts repeatedly show certain categories of risk, such as misconfigured access controls or weak logging, a baseline can require consistent patterns that reduce those risks across systems. This helps delivery because teams no longer debate basic controls each time, and it helps auditability because consistent controls are easier to verify. Baselines also support fairness, because teams know the minimum expectations ahead of time and can plan for them. Architects should be careful, though, because baselines that are too heavy can slow work and cause workarounds. while baselines that are too light fail to reduce meaningful risk. Risk artifacts help calibrate baselines by showing what risks are common and which risks are high impact. Beginners sometimes assume baselines are only compliance-driven, but a well-designed baseline is a risk-driven tool that improves both security and predictability. When baselines are grounded in artifacts, they stay relevant rather than becoming outdated rituals. To conclude, incorporating risk assessment artifacts into architecture choices is the discipline of using structured risk thinking to guide decisions, justify trade-offs, and preserve accountability over time. You start by understanding what artifacts are, from asset criticality and data flows to threat models, vulnerability findings, and risk treatment records, and then you treat them as inputs to design rather than as paperwork to file away. You use these artifacts to prioritize controls based on CIA needs, to reveal trust boundaries and exposure paths, and to shape decisions that balance security outcomes with operational constraints. You link architectural choices back to specific risk statements so decisions are traceable, defensible, and easier to review, and you respect risk acceptance decisions while designing monitoring and containment that prevents silent expansion of accepted risk. You also treat artifacts as living assumptions that must be revisited when systems change, and you handle uncertainty by choosing designs that remain safe even when exact risk estimates are imperfect. When you develop this habit, your architecture becomes more coherent, more explainable, and more resilient under audit and incident scrutiny, which is exactly the maturity this certification expects.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.